Great, thank you, Dallin. I will share my screen in just a moment. We'll first start with some introductions. I'll go first. My name is Kate, and I primarily work at IBM. I have two different roles at IBM, one of them being a software developer and the other one being the Global Technical Ambassador Lead for IBM Quantum. So please do reach out to me if you're interested at all in quantum computing. And we have one other host today that's going to be presenting our questions to our wonderful panelists that have joined us. So I'll let Paul introduce himself next.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Neville. I have a background originally in hard engineering, mechanical engineering, but for the last, 25 plus years, I've been a professional software developer. My interest in smart cities came about when I joined Geovation, which is Ordnance Survey's Open Innovation Centre, 5 years ago. And Ordnance Survey has a strong interest in smart cities. I left Geovation 6 months ago, and I'm now a freelance fractional Chief Technology Officer. But when the opportunity to help set up this webinar and co-present came around, I thought I would have a go. So that's why I'm here. So thank you very much for that, Kate. So now I'll ask our co-presenters, panelists, to introduce themselves in no particular order. I'm just going to take them in the order that they appear on my screen. So I'll start with Dr. Alan Penn, please.
Hello, right. I'm Alan Penn. I'm a professor of architectural and urban computing at the Bartlett at UCL. I'm an architect by background, actually. And I'm also the chief scientific advisor to the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And so smart cities are a part of the sort of day job in both places. I'm going to come clean. I don't think there's any such thing as a smart city. There are only cities that help citizens be smarter. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Alan. My apologies for demoting you. I called you doctor and you're professor. Sorry about that.
I'm sure we'll be keen to pick Alan's brain about his last statement there. Freddie's next on my screen. Would you like to go next, Freddie?
Yes, good evening all. Yeah, my name is Freddy Tallberg, and my background is predominantly around serial entrepreneurship on the tech space. My last sort of generation of businesses have all been in the smart city agenda. I built the first sort of complex routing engine for HGVs in London. We ran the mapping for the 2012 Olympic Games for the commercial freight and VIPs. And I've literally driven around London and I've surveyed it and mapped it and published maps as well. And now we're currently run a environmental clean tech business. And really our mission in EMSOL is about trying to reduce the transport pollution in a sort of scalable way across urban areas. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks. Next on my screen is Dale.
Hi, my name is Dale Perkins-McCook. I am the founder of Elad Tech and I'm the co-founder of DWIS Fast and Syndicate. I specialize in emerging technology with a strong focus on blockchain. I also met Paul at Geovation because I'm also a Geovation member, and got a strong focus on prop tech, smart buildings, decentralized ledgers. That's the world that I've been living in for quite a few years.
Thank you, Dale. Finally, Matt, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, cool. Good evening, everyone. Matt Armstrong-Barnes. I'm Chief Technologist for Artificial Intelligence at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. However, today I'm here representing techUK because I'm the chair of techUK's Smart City Working Group. And what we see in terms of engagement with members is smart cities falls into sort of three categories. I'll have a conversation with Alan in a bit, namely covering artificial intelligence around the volume of data that's coming out of cities and the sensors that live in them and how we can get value out of that data and empower the citizen. Security, paramount, who should have access and what should they be using it for? And lastly, connectivity. So how do we make ubiquitous connectivity across urban scenarios where we can start to get the data from the distributed nature of the data, work out how to get value from it and get it to the right places and the right people who can use it to make informed decisions.
Great. Thank you for that, Matt. So we've had our introductions from our panelists. Just a note to the audience, the next section of the session this evening, we'll be going through some prepared questions that we have to address to our panel. For the panelists' benefit, if you'd like to go first, just literally wave, because I'm not sure there's a hand up option on GoToWebinar. So if you'd like to go first, please do wave, and either Paul or myself will call on you to go first or second, and etc. For the audience, we do have some dedicated time at the end to answer audience questions, and you're really, really lucky to have an expert panel available today to pick their brains on all things smart cities. So I really encourage you to do ask questions in the chat function. Paul and I will keep an eye on that, and we will be addressing those questions in the last 15 minutes or so. I will also try to share my screen once Paul's introduced the first question, so that it's on the screen for the benefit of the panelists as well. So I'll go ahead and try to share that, Paul, and if you want to start introducing the first question, hopefully by the time you're done, it will be on the screen.
Thank you. So just to give a context to this whole webinar, there is both nationally and internationally, one might even say globally, a conversation starting about inclusivity to make sure that whether it's in the public domain or the private domain, whether we're talking about healthcare, government or technology, that what we are doing is done for everyone and that nobody gets left behind. So that's the motivation behind the questions that are being asked here, some of which are purposely challenging in order to make sure that we are doing our due diligence, and also to give our speakers a chance to answer those questions and make us all feel hopefully more comfortable that we are indeed being inclusive. So the first question is a very broad one. What do you see as being the point of smart cities? Now, what I mean by that is, where does the responsibility lie for a smart city? Is it purely a civic responsibility? Should it be down to national government, local government? Should it be something that businesses take on for themselves? Should there be a legislative requirement for businesses to report on things like, for example, their emissions? Where does the responsibility lie, and what is the point? Why do we have smart cities in the first place?
And Paul, just before we go to the panelists, now that I'm sharing my screen, I cannot see anyone's videos, so if anyone's waving, you're going to have to ask them.
Okay. No, nobody's waving at the moment. So I'm going to randomly pick Matt.
I'll jump in. So I think what we're seeing is this explosion of generation of data outside of the traditional data center or the cloud, and that can be anywhere. So on an oil rig, on a bus, in a taxi, in the International Space Station, data is being generated in all of these locations. And what we need to do from a smart cities perspective is critically work out what the use cases are, so they're going to add the right kind of value, work out what data is coming out of those data points, and then work out how we can make them much more available so we can make better decisions. So in terms of why smart cities are A, becoming more relevant, B, we're seeing greater degrees of adoption, and C, we're starting to see them rolled out slowly in the UK, but other cities are really embracing the technology, is because we need to make better decisions about how we're building, how we're managing, and how we're controlling the environments in which people are living.
And those decisions, who is the end point, if you like, that's being informed of these things, and to what end? So in other words, whose job is it to set the questions that are answered by the smart city? Is that a spread of responsibility, or should it be focused in a particular place? Should it be government setting that? Should it be business deciding what's the best place and the best thing to report on? How do we make sure that we're joined up in our thinking in that respect?
I can continue if you want me to. I think it depends on the use case. So what is a smart city? Sorry. I think I would ask the question, or tag the next one on, what is a smart city? I know that Alan's put his hand up. I'll let Alan talk, and then I can jump back in and provide a point of view on it.
Sure.
So I've already set out my stall in saying there's no such thing as a smart city. But what I actually want to say is that actually what's smart about cities or what's dumb about cities isn't particularly in their infrastructure or their technology. It's in the human capital that they contain. And so if we take a very long history and we go back to 10,000, 12,000 BC, when people first started building dense settlements, that density then triggered everything else. They learned to do agriculture, they learned to write, they learned to create money and so created an economy. And this happened just within a few millennia of those first dense settlements, that proto-cities, if you like. Now, for me, that's what is smart. The smartness there is the innovation that comes from human contact and density. And of course, what we're seeing today is these technologies, which are just the latest in a set of those innovations, the communication technologies we're using at this minute, adding to that and actually radically shrinking the size of the world. I don't know how far away out of the members of the audience there are this evening, the furthest are, but even if they're just across London, they're quite some distance apart. But you know, I regularly have PhD supervisions with my PhD students in China, and it's, you know, we shrunk the world to a pinhead effectively, and that density is smartness. That's my sort of answer to where the smartness sits. It's human contact.
Does anyone else want to tackle this?
You know, like I think one thing that frustrates me a little bit about this whole concept of data and smart cities is what a smart city shouldn't be, and the thing that really winds me up is that you got local authorities or the legislators of our cities driving, you know, bits of data and using it to exploit people in the cities, and so it's driving a lot of people out of it. And so, you know, if you look at how the penalty charge notice and the camera technology that's been deployed, how that's used in anger against everyone who makes a silly mistake, and how, you know, so I think even if you look at the congestion charge zone and the ultra low emission zone, congestion charge zone, we still got congestion, so it doesn't sort of really work, but they still keep charging for it. So at the moment is, I think what's really frustrating for me is we innovate great technology, we innovate great data, we got it, and you know, and it's become much more consumable, ready available, but yet is used against the joy and the merits of really living in a city. And it's sort of, you know, so I think I think people leave the cities because they get just fed up because of all these sort of the pressures associated with how the data is being used against individuals, how they want to live. And so I think there's a balance between the human, the people side, and the legislators in there, and certainly I think that the challenges that we have in some cities is you have, certainly in London, you've got what, 34 different local authorities all having their own budget constraints, and even TfL are asking for a bailout on Saturday, so who knows what's going to happen to TfL. So it all ends up being political and financial pressure that really drives the agenda, which is just irritating because it should be innovation people led.
But Freddie, can I pursue something there? Isn't there a tipping point about to come when all our vehicles are truly autonomous and we don't own cars and have them parked outside our house all the time? We get rid of the congestion because you only need as many, you know, sort of autonomous Ubers or whatever driving around to pick people up.
But specialising in artificial intelligence, what I can say is I send the video on YouTube of how the magic roundabout in Swindon works, and I set the autonomous drive people a challenge of when you can get autonomous cars to navigate that. I think we'll have a chance in this country.
I think, Alan, you know, like the thing about autonomous is a great vision, and I think there's a bit of like, oh, because you've got this amazing technology, this is how it's going to work. And I think everything's about a journey. People evolve and people exploit their technology. And I think we're seeing great uses of how people are evolving certain technologies, particularly in the built environment with new materials and how we want to live. And if you look at the work that TfL have done in Healthy Streets, that approach is awesome. you know, and but it just takes time, and I just don't think people are going to consume technology for the sake of because it exists. It is about, you know, well-being and living and being part of a sort of society that wants to sort of do the right thing, and I just think it is a people-led initiative.
Dale,
yeah, I'd like to jump in there. I do agree with Freddie. I think that we're always going to be suffering this battle where the innovation is kind of spurred by profit. There's always going to be that element that actually what gets delivered and what gets deployed always has to have some sort of financial gain to kind of see the day of light. Personally, I also feel like potentially it's an attack on the poor because, okay, yeah, we can have autonomous vehicles, but we're already seeing that people can't afford to get ULEZ compliant vehicles, and they're being pushed out of the city, and potentially these vehicles are not being used on the road. And then what happens to the waste of all of these vehicles? We've got so many diesel and petrol vehicles in the car on the road. Where do they go? How are we going to repurpose them? I think with
no scrappage scheme, you're sort of, you know, they're just being pushed out, right? You know, the pollution still exists, but it's just being pushed out. So not in my neighborhood, you know, just go somewhere else, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's also that thin line of we kind of have the profit and innovation, we have the people, but we also do have nature, and it's trying to find that sort of the equilibrium, the really nice balance where smart cities are harmonious with nature as well as benefiting the people, and it's not just all about profit and governments putting legislation and restrictions on the public.
But right, in terms of innovation and how you fund that, so there are a number of ways that, in terms of techUK engaging with our members and also speaking to policymakers as well as local authorities, and there seems to be two main ways that you can fund these initiatives. One is that you look at them from a use case by use case perspective, and we've not seen that be successful. So if you look at each use case in isolation, no single use case stacks up to support the investment that you need in order to put smart capability in place. The more successful authorities are putting in a foundation, and then they're finding use cases that they can then turn on that foundation they put in place. COVID being the prime example, one local authority that we spoke to from a techUK perspective put the infrastructure in place to support a number of use cases. COVID came along, and as a result, they just had to turn on the COVID use case, looking at social distancing. So I think that in terms of the innovation and the cost associated with it, we have to bear in mind of, you know, there is investment that's needed to support these cases, but you need to work out how effectively you're going to build the procurement cycle and build out the capability in a way that is affordable and sustainable.
Thank you for that, Matt. I think that might be a good point to, shall we move on to the next question, Paul?
Sure, it does lead nicely from what's just been said, actually, which is rather fortunate for us.
There we are. I'll read this one out, and then Paul, you're going to have to be my eyes.
Sure.
But to follow nicely on from Matt's point there, arguably the biggest benefit from smart cities will be found in the poorest areas of any city where pollution or traffic or general issues have their greatest impact. So how do we make sure that the areas that are most in need of smart city and the associated technology do not get left behind when we see these technologies and monitoring devices being implemented?
Alan?
Can I do my link that I was going to make to Dale, who I think is absolutely right? What he's pointing to just now was a difference between how we think of smartness. And it seems to me that you can only get smartness if you apply wisdom rather than just knowledge. So being smart is about being just. It's about setting up the systems in such a way that there's some sort of natural justice, and you make not just, you know, intelligent decisions that might be the most profit-making, but decisions that may not be the most profit-making, but are really wise in the long term, that are sustainable, that are socially equitable, and so forth. That seems to me to be the real key, is you've actually got to have, if you like, an ethics associated with what we think of as smartness. And it's that position that the system needs to adopt. Now, this is where things like the blockchain or distributed ledger technologies more generally are actually really interesting because they have inherent in them some ideas about trust and immutability and so forth. They're really hard to defraud and to use. You can use them for bad purposes, but within the system they have their own integrity, if you like. And that seems to me to be where there's really potentially really smart and ethical potential within digital systems of this sort.
Dale, I think you were ready to respond to that anyway, so over to you.
Yeah, no, I do agree with Alan. I do agree with him. And I think when we're talking about poorer areas and trying to get them sort of tagging along with the movement of the smart cities, because unfortunately it's definitely going to be central London and the main hubs that it kind of spurs out of first, but there has to be sort of incentives from lower and higher government. Some of this power has to be given back to local councils where they can have sandboxes or test beds where they can actually invite companies and businesses in to deploy and test some of these sensors, whichever way you kind of want to look at a smart city, but it doesn't all just sort of flock to the centre of London. You actually kind of open your doors to the innovation and do test beds, and then use that and the data with the local residents and get feedback. And are they happy with these deployments? Is it helping their life in any way? Or is it just another company coming in to harvest some data to sell out of the back door?
Yeah.
Just
Matt, I think you were.
Yes, we engaged with one local authority in London, and their use cases were rough sleeping. They were looking at climate impact, and a number of much more humanitarian ones than I think that Freddie was talking about in terms of charging you for parking or things along those lines. I think just to build on what Dale was saying, which I think is a really great point, what we're not seeing is commonality. So we're seeing each individual area, and across the UK-wide this problem is, who are all trying to tackle these problems on their own. So instead of saying, we've built a reference architecture, we've got a way of tackling some of these problems that's been deployed over here, we've built some framework around it, we know how it's going to work, be that in a sandbox environment or something else, there's no sharing of that knowledge, either how it happens locally that's then shared into central government, which is then pushed out as being, this is the way that you embrace this type of technology. We're also seeing lack of, or either lack of is probably the wrong way of phrasing it, too many interoperability standards, which too many interoperability standards means lack of interoperability because you've got too many choices. So making some policy decisions that enable people to make better decisions while learning from what other people are doing means that we're going to be much quicker at deploying this technology, because it seems that every local authority is tripping over themselves trying to learn all the lessons that every other authority is tripping over as well.
Well, what I don't understand, Matt, is what technology you're talking about. Like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Traffic management solutions, or are you talking about built environment technology, or transport technology, or what you're talking about in terms of technology?
Yes, yeah, all of the above. So if you have let's take my rough sleeping example. So a common problem in many cities, how are we tackling that? Well, artificial intelligence is a key way of spotting whether or not somebody arrives in locations, whether or not they are sleeping, things along those lines. You can do that with analytics. You don't need to necessarily apply AI. Lots of ways that you can tackle that problem. Where you do the processing, do you process at the edge? Do you move the data back into more traditional data centers? Do you have staging locations? How much data do you move around? Where do you move it from point A to point B? All of these problems are being tackled by one authority that is trying to build a reference architecture. In terms of people, so I don't live in London, I'm closer to Manchester. So Manchester has that problem.
Can I just do a bit of sanity checking here? At the beginning of the lockdown, one of the things we did in the department was to try to get all rough sleepers off the streets. Now, that was actually a government manifesto promise at the beginning of the government, but the pandemic concentrated minds enormously. And it was done. And we did it by essentially taking over budget hotels and getting them off the street. It didn't require great reams of technology to make it possible. It required political will and cash, actually,
Well, it's
to make
money,
it happen.
isn't it? Yeah, it's cash. Yeah.
What I worry about
how sustainable is that?
Spotting
exactly.
rough sleepers with intelligent cameras actually sounds much too close to policing to me than to actually solving the problem. If the money that was spent on those systems was spent on the hotel rooms, perhaps we wouldn't have the problem in the first place.
I think I agree, Alan. It's like, it's how sustainable is that, and what's the longer, how do you sort of build a community on the back end of that? It is fundamentally a money equation, and so I think local authorities, the reason they charge for shed loads of parking fines and whatever is because they're sort of desperate for cash and they need the influx. But I think the benefit that the local authorities have got, they've got planning consent capability. And then I think it's about, our local communities have got lots of people in, and then I think connectivity, infrastructure connectivity is crucial. So that is like making sure you got access to public transport, and where there's connectivity, you're going to get people living there. And it's about driving and enabling planning consents to enable people to innovate and build infrastructure and places to live that is desirable for that area. Like there's an area that I play football at, and I've been doing that for the last 10 years, is in a very dodgy part of Battersea, but I can see the investment that's gone in, the planning consent's been given, and that place is really developed beautifully. And they've still got the same schools there, and they've innovated with all sorts of stuff, and they've made the whole environment look, absolutely amazing. And it's really just driven up standards. But unfortunately, it is an economic challenge. It's about how do you sort of get people to invest, and even the concept around electric charging is a really good example. Is should the government and local authorities be funding charging infrastructure? The reality is, they can't afford to do that, and the governments shouldn't be on account to fund and build everything. You've got to get the business model right. So you've got to figure out where's the business model that's going to get desirable to put investors to put money into areas that to try and develop it. And so the challenge is threefold: local authorities, investment capital, and innovators to build stuff that the business model works for the local community.
Thank you for that, Freddie. Paul, do you think it's a good time to introduce the next question?
I do, because it follows on again very nicely from what you just said.
I thought so.
Hopefully there's more to say on this subject. I imagine there is. The question is, what is the benefit of a smart city without the money to be able to implement change as a result? And following on from that, and probably at the core of that actually, is where do smart cities change from being technological tools to being political tools? And is it a good thing that they change from technological tools to political tools? And if it's not, what should smart cities look like? Dale, you've wanting to say something on this particular subject.
Yeah, I think sort of merging the two from the last thing that Freddie said and what you said about what's the point of a smart city without the money to implement it. I think it's changing the mindset of actually going, the people that are going to be using this technology can also be part of the investment. The charging points is a typical one. I know the government's put some legislation in place where now every new house that's built has to have a charging point, an electrical car charging point. But it's like, well, what does that look like? If you can be somebody that's just moved into a new house, and you could potentially turn that charging point into a source of revenue for yourself, then the investment looks very different, because you're investing potentially in your own property if you're building it, and it can produce a revenue. Again, it's about the decentralization. There's a lot of concepts out there where these autonomous cars will be driving and paying for the electricity themselves. So if we're going to be in this autonomous world where we have objects moving around, using the city, using power, why cannot the individuals and the community be providing that service for a profit, which will just naturally spur investment in the infrastructure? Going back to the question about should it be a political tool, I think unfortunately it's always going to be used as a political tool. I'm not sure if we can ever get away from that, whether it's to put legislation in, whether it's to increase adoption, whether it's to increase more measures. put companies underneath on top of the fire. It's going to be used, I think, more and more as we go forward.
But presumably there can be, and one would hope there would be, a positive aspect to that, because clearly government potentially has the funds to resource the initiatives that they're trying to put in place. And as Alan was saying, you know, with regard to homelessness and sorting out homelessness, if what we loosely categorize as smart cities can help with that, although Alan suggests that we don't need them to help with that, but there may be other things that do require some extra technology, for example, pollution, let's say, or congestion, then is it such a bad thing that it becomes a political tool and that it is paid for through taxation in essence? Or should we just steer clear of that altogether and keep it as a technological initiative and allow the market to drive what it will?
So I want to come in on this because I think it's really dangerous to think of political as being bad. There is political that's bad and there's political that's good. And what I think this sort of harks back to the question about needing an ethics, needing something underpinning the whole thing that tries to tilt it in favour of the good rather than the bad. Now, what do I mean by good and bad? Well, I think that what really matters is giving people autonomy. That is, giving them the ability to make their own decisions about the things that affect their lives. Just so long, with the one restriction, if you like, that those decisions don't impact on the lives of others. So, you know, you can't go off and burn coal because that will destroy the climate and the planet and the future of generations. We've got a responsibility to them. So for that reason, I think that what we need to do is to work with the idea of what is it about these technologies that creates autonomy for people and allows them to live their fulfilling, you know, maximum life to the greatest benefit without them depriving other people of their autonomy. And that's the trick. You know, if we could devise that and say what it means in terms of the systems that we're talking about as smart cities, whether those are parking systems or about housing, the housing crisis, the housing problems, then I think we're doing well. I think there's a lot of putting flesh on the bones, though, that's required to make this into something real.
Right.
I think just to add to that, I think it's strange for a technologist to say this. It's use cases. So yes, we talked about reference architectures before. I think they're interesting, but the use cases or what you're using that technology for is the interesting part. And as Alan alluded to, that's kind of where we need to nail in to the ones that there are certain use cases that are going to bring in revenue. There are certain use cases that aren't going to bring in revenue. So as a result, it is a case of what's the prioritization of those, how are they deployed, how are they governed, how are they managed, and how do you get the data out of them?
I think, I think what's interesting is that politically, certainly, if you look at all the local councillors, they represent the community and they have their own manifestos and they sort of drive their electioneering based on local needs. And and what's interesting, because obviously we're an air pollution business, and always keep an eye out for everyone presenting and talking about air pollution. But the majority of the local councillors in London were promoting an agenda of like air pollution and the green sustainability agenda. But the reality is they had no power to really do much. They didn't have any access to a magic wand, but it was really what people sort of like. But technology, as we know, is becoming so much more accessible. So it's like, these councillors have got access to data, got access to to enabling bits and pieces. So I think, I think what's really exciting is everything's in reach. Everything's in reach of people who care, and they could use that political pressure and those manifestos to try and drive things. And I think what is the answer to this, and we're gradually getting to it, is the difference between standards and the difference between regulation. And I think what we have seen, I'll give you a good example, is I worked on a project a couple of years ago when Crossrail was being built. Crossrail, I don't know if you remember, but at the time there was lots of cyclists who were being killed by truck drivers because they were making left turns, and that was like it was happening all the time. And I had a sort of you know, that was a big campaign thing for me to try and go, how the hell and why is that happening? And what we did as an industry is we got together, particularly with Crossrail, to go, actually, how do we as an industry solve this? No one's giving us legislation, no one's giving us the regulations to do this. And we, across the industry, solved the problem. And I built a navigation system that mitigated left turns by time of day, and that was built into navigation systems for truck drivers. And there's a whole new driver standard coming up. And when Crossrail procured any goods and services, they made sure there was driver training, and all the drivers had to have urban training. So what we did is that we solved the problem by driving that new standard. And once that standard was achieved and we got that behavior across all the different stakeholders, then regulations and standards started to become prescribed in planning consents and planning permissions, that this is the way we do things. And so I think the democratized approach around dealing with local problems, from councillors to what's really dealing with, you know, the local neighbourhoods, to driving innovation through driving a community of standards. It goes, this is the way we behave in our community. And then we as innovators and technologists have got to backfill that to make it stick, right? To make it scalable and low cost, to make it become a regulation. And I think that's the beauty of innovation. And the people who tip the apple cart is the local authorities who sort of want to leverage that technology to make profit. So that's the annoying thing for us, because you've got innovation-led solutions to go behavioral change, all about innovation. But if you use a technology to penalize people because you're short of cash in your balance sheet, then that just slows down the whole opportunities around how cities can be smart.
And the roundabout you're talking about is the Bow roundabout, I presume. Is that right?
Well, I know Bow roundabout, that was well funded, wasn't it, as a pilot project? But yeah, yes. Bow had a lot of problems, and a lot of even over in Lambeth Bridge, we had, you know,
bridges as well.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that simply because
that's a really nice example, Freddie. Yeah, and I think what it points towards is actually what it means to say that we are going to adopt something ethical. And what you've defined there is a process by which people got together, technologists got together to solve the problem. And that's about people taking responsibility.
Yeah.
So to my mind, this is a social construct. It may well be supported by Zoom or some method of communicating and getting everybody together more easily. But actually what's required is the social construct of people deciding we are going to get together and take action. That's political, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make one point, which I think is something that Alan, both you, Dale, and Freddie have said in terms of democratization. So at what point does a smart city become a use my charge point app? So something that Dale mentioned about having a charging point in your house. Freddie was talking about democratization, and you were talking about social constructs. So if a bunch of people get together and work out how they can do that, rent my driveway, in terms of tackling some of those social problems. And I think that's where we start to see, is there a blurred boundary there between what's a smart city versus what's a collection of individuals getting together to build an application for their local environment?
It's an app on the blockchain, isn't it? You can make micropayments, smart contracts. There you are. Done.
Yeah.
No,
yeah. Freddie's next idea.
Freddie and Al, and then later Matt, I think your points actually lead us really nicely on to our next question anyway. Freddie, obviously you came up with an example there of where, well, this technology actually really did make a difference. Alan, again, you reflected on the fact that this is an example where it is for political use, but it's for good political use, as you were saying, the difference between good and bad. And I think the next question is hitting home on this point here. So how do smart cities actually make a difference? And are there other examples where monitoring or this technology has actually affected change?
I can talk about a project we're working on that is hopefully going to affect change, but we haven't changed. I've actually got one example that is sort of evidencing some change. And I give you, if that's okay, you know, as I mentioned, that we measure air pollution, and look at the root cause of what's causing pollution in real time. And we deployed a system at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And what we do is we say, I want those goods and services, but when you deliver those goods and services to my hospital, you can't impact my environment. And what we do is we've managed now to identify individual vehicles, individual drivers who have actually breached air pollution levels for that delivery activity to happen. And they've taken them either off-site or they've actually written a business case to justify to change a vehicle before it's sort of, time of age of being scrapped. So that's one example. And the other example I think is really interesting is we are working with a couple of waste locations in the central city area. Now, those waste locations now are bordering lots of really nice smart residential areas because they weren't built 10 years ago, but they've all been built now. And now the people living in residential areas go, oh, I don't want all this sort of dirt and environmental sort of pollution causing, my lovely sort of, £500,000 apartment to be dusty. So what we're doing is we are looking at monitoring businesses that have been there for ages, businesses that have been operating day to day, and helping them with the monitoring and real-time evidence of who's causing what pollution and how can you mitigate that pollution once you know what the root cause of that pollution is, so they can sort of operate and evidence their behavior of sustaining a sort of an operation, keeping that business going without it being shut down because of too much political pressure. We haven't got the evidence of that yet, but it's moving that direction.
Can I give an example about monitoring and affecting change? We did some research, this is years ago, looking at actually hospitals again. The NHS came because they got real problems with car crime taking place in their car parks. And they said, we've put in CCTV and we thought that it would have worked. And, the crime dropped just after we put in the TV cameras. But then it's all crept back up again. And, we've still got the TV cameras, they're still there, but the crime has gone back up again. And so we did a study of this and we got precise locations for where all the cars being nicked and broken into were in the car parks in a set of hospitals. And we found something really interesting. We found that being within sight of a TV camera didn't actually make any difference. There were cars broken into within the view shed of the cameras. What made a difference? And being in sight of a window didn't make any difference either. What made a difference was being within sight of a door, because out of doors somebody walks out and sees you fiddling with the car. The kids that were doing the breaking into cars were very smart, and they knew that if they were around the corner, they could hear the person coming and start twiddling their thumbs and pretending to do something else. Yeah, very simple. So you had to be, if you want to park in a car park in a hospital, park within vision of the door, any entrance. Much safer than being out around the corner from it. And that says something, because that's about monitoring and supervision, but it's the virtual presence of real people that matters, not the fact that I could be seen through a TV camera.
I think we're seeing there's quite a lot of evidence around quality and positioning of CCTV cameras. CCTV cameras are admissibility. So if you are talking about criminal activities, how admissible are they? How clear was the image? Was it the person in question? Versus a human being see you is much more admissible and defendable in a court of law. So I think CCTV infrastructure, when used correctly, so for example, we're seeing quite a lot of activity around cyclist safety. So spotting flows of traffic, spotting flows of cyclists, allowing that to be used to make informed decisions about how you flow people around areas where there's significant amounts of traffic, what you can do from that perspective, which is one of the use cases from a smart city CCTV perspective. But fewer and fewer use cases are revolving around security, specifically lower quality images. A lot of them aren't particularly good, especially in low light conditions. And as a result, the criminal element, who, to your point, Alan, learn quite quickly, have learned the fact of actually this isn't the right kind of defence mechanism to put in place to prevent that type of behaviour.
So body cams on policemen have made a radical difference to police behaviour.
Yeah. Wow.
And I think there are some lessons in all of this.
Much higher quality images. I know it's a problem in policing, storing all of that data, analysing what's going to be of value, and loading it and analysing it is actually becoming quite a challenge. But they're in the right places to catch faces, to hear conversations, so that you can do behavioural you can understand behaviour much better. Whereas obviously a camera that's 20, 30 foot in the air that's angled incorrectly just isn't right for that kind of use case.
I think, you know, one of the things that I know has had huge impact is better lighting and intelligent lighting systems. And then I think the other thing that I think is really quite important for smart cities is the cost of lighting. That the new material science with LED lighting has actually reduced the amount of burden of cost, because the local authorities just had to switch the lights off because they didn't want that burden of cost. And then you got this issue about local light pollution. So I think now you got like slightly smarter paths across parks and different times where it's better lit, but it's not costing a fortune, and is and it's balanced between light pollution balances and technology. So I think lighting is a huge part of our sort of safety in our urban areas, particularly sort of when we're sort of running the city 24 hours, but also recognizing there is light pollution challenges and sort of urban existence challenges with that as well. But I think that's a really good example. But without the material science, that would be really an expensive proposition.
No, I agree. Thank you for that, Freddie. I think we'll take a pause there and move on to our second last question. Oh,
yeah.
There we go. Paul, if you want to introduce this one.
Yes. So we're all technologists here, and we all know the pull of the new and solving problems that present themselves. The harder the better, because it gives us more work to do that we enjoy. On the flip side of that, are we guilty perhaps of concentrating too much on developing the technology rather than on actually implementing and installing the sensors or other related equipment required to, well, as the question says here, and as I originally wrote it, make cities smart, but perhaps I could rephrase it as enable cities to be smart and enable communities to be smart. And in that respect, do you have any examples of some perhaps simpler things that you have conducted experiments with that have given interesting results?
I think it's certainly one of my challenges is when I started the business, I bought into the concept of IoT. And I studied IoT and I thought, wow, fantastic. I'm going to get into IoT because you got low cost sensors, low power, and I can deploy this stuff and it'd be, but oh my God, the reality of it, this stuff needs power, it needs 4G, LoRa, all those stories about, LoRaWAN and Sigfox is going to be like amazing. And it's like, it was just rubbish, and it was like, it was just so difficult for an entrepreneur to scale with this amazing new technology that looks great on paper, but in reality, it's very, very clunky. And so I think, so in some ways I had to sort of, raise more money and it cost me more. So our implementation has been slower. I think we're in the game now with the data, but oh boy, do we need the technology to be more robust and enterprise grade and the ability for us to run a proper business, because at the moment, the technology we use in the field is so flaky. And then we had to divert back to the, is there a power socket here and can I use a 4G or can I get a sort of, internet connection? And it's sort of, we can't really like accelerate unless we sort of make sure we get enterprise grade technology that can work in the field. But it's maybe more of a journey, but it's just painful, and it's just cost me energy, time. I don't know a good example where innovative technology is really working really well at scale in urban areas. I don't know, it'd be great to see it.
So I've got smart meter installed.
What I was going to say is, what sensors for what purpose? Because as probably just building on what Freddie said, the explosion in the type of sensors that you can get is massive.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Keep going back to this use cases. What do you want to do with it? How are you going to get value from the data? And I'm probably I'm opening us nicely for Alan to take over in a minute and talk about, if he starts talking about smart meters. But it is about what data do you want to gather? What do you want to do with that use case? The technology is advancing very rapidly. Refer to my earlier point, is there too many standards, and they're having varying degrees of success. And we've yet to have the standards war where one particularly wins out over another, because actually they're good at some use cases and not at others. Depending if you've got power or if you're running on battery will heavily dictate which one of the standards that you pick up. But yeah, once you get that, what do you want to do with the data? That's when you start to thinking about, right, okay, what sensors do I need to deploy and what technology do I need to put in the middle that's going to aggregate it all together? Cue Alan to talk about smart meters.
So I got the smart meter in. Yeah, the bloke came around after much booking and eventually turned up with his smart meter, unplugged the old meter, plugged in the new smart meter, then tried to get a Vodafone signal because he needed it in order to. Now, I could have told him that we won't have coverage. We're in North London, you know, there's no bloody mobile coverage here. But it still has to be made smart. You know, I'm still,
can I plug into your Wi-Fi? It's great.
It's properly connected. Anyway, so there's a serious point though, which is we are increasingly dependent on what seem to be very efficient, probably profitable, but rather fragile technologies. So look at what happens when the power goes out in the north of England because of a storm. All of a sudden, nobody can charge their mobile phones and they're all out of communication. And you know, if you're relying on mobiles now rather than having a landline, you've had it.
Well, they're sitting in cars charging their phone, aren't they, now, with the engine on?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's a complete, we need to think much more about resilience and about effective technologies, not just efficient ones, and not so much about profit, and more about, you know, the sort of benefit, if you like, what it is we're actually trying to do.
Yeah, I think for me, the sensors will always have to play their part. That's just the core way of the way we're sort of gathering data. But I think the technologies for the smart cities are so much more than just the sensors. But there's so much more out there that's gonna make the city, make the building smarter without the sensors. There's typical things like a fireman goes to a building and they don't have any blueprint of how they're getting in. They don't necessarily need a sensor, but they need the connectivity to the right system to see the right blueprints in order for them to save people's lives. Another one is a company called Power Ledger, talking about power. And they have like micro and pico grids that they build in communities that of course run on the blockchain, but people use their solar power to store energy in a battery shed, and they could potentially trade power. Also, if the main grid goes down, your lights stay on. So I think when we're thinking of smart cities, we're always thinking about movement of vehicles, movement of people, but actually there's so much more to some of the technologies that are surfacing out there that aren't really geared towards just gathering data and using sensors for the purpose of a smart city.
I think you've got other, just to put the smart cities, movement of people and telecommunications together. So you don't necessarily, we've got quite a lot of infrastructure already deployed in cities that allows for triangulation. So I think it's assuming you get coverage, to Alan's point, but that does mean that you are in the individual telco space. They've kind of got some of that capability, and the other one is the relationship that smartphones have got. So I know in Germany they're doing quite a lot of things about find me a car parking space, which they do using a variety of crowdsourcing, actually people going around looking for spotting places, and then it's a subscription service, but you can subscribe. I think it might be in Dusseldorf. You subscribe to an app and it will route you to an available car parking space. And it does all of that using the GPS location on your phone. Local smarts provided by people in the city are part of the equation as well as the crowdsourcing. So we're starting to see much more I think Freddie made the point about democratization, much more about democratization and people understanding the value that they can provide from a data perspective when they aggregate it with data from other people. And I think as we start to blur the bounds between data provided by people and data provided by sensors, that's where we're going to cover the challenges that Alan mentioned about not having signal from a particular telecommunications provider, because people can provide some of that capability as well.
No, thank you for that point, Matt. I'm keen to answer some of the audience questions with the remaining time we have left. So Paul, I'll save our final question as a backup if we have any extra time. But looking to the message panel, I'm just going to pick the first one I can see here. So this one is from Maiwa. How do you convince construction industry leaders to adopt technology such as IoT devices and things? Would anyone like to answer that one? Dale?
So I think for them, it's all about margins. So if we can give them more efficient processes, we can improve their margins. It doesn't take long for them to get on board. We're seeing them adopting some of these technologies like the VR technology already, where they're going to sites and they can literally kind of see the site built in front of them right there without having to have a creative mind and the old way we used to do it with visualization. Also, they're potentially having these digital twins, so they're running analytics on buildings or on sites to kind of see how efficient some of the processes are before they even get out into the field and use it. So the technology is out there, but also I think maybe it's about not necessarily the marketing, but the awareness and how are they being reached, how are they being contacted. I know Paul, obviously, us coming from Geovation, there's a lot of innovation in this field. There's loads of innovation, but it's about getting the innovation in front of the right people in order for it to get adopted.
Yeah.
I think two things to add. One is, I think, yeah, we're definitely seeing it on the manufacturing side, as in, sorry, not the manufacturer, on the construction side, where we're seeing smart technology play a role in safety. I think where it needs to really be driven is from consumers, and consumers being individuals who are buying houses or organizations who are leasing or buying buildings. They should be starting to expect this type of technology. I'm going to do a very bad job of using some history now, Alan. So I don't know if anyone remembers the single socket, where you went into a house and there were single sockets. And obviously consumer demand changed, and now you go in and you find banks of sockets inside houses at the right places, because that's what consumers have expected, and the construction industry has risen to that demand and it's changed its behaviours. It is slower, and we've got quite a rapidly evolving set of technology and use cases. Lots more organisations are starting to expect smart buildings, so they're starting to want to have visibility over smart lighting, smart power, smart access points. So this kind of technology is starting to be expected by businesses and by consumers, but that's going to be the real driving force behind changes in the construction industry, I think.
I think, I mean, the one thing I'd say in the construction industry is that it does innovate when it makes sense to do so. So if you think about the things that have made a real difference to construction, it's things like the pneumatic drill or the JCB, digger, or the skill saw, the hand power tools. If you go 100 years back, it was all hand tools and an awful lot of muscle power that was required to build things. Now it's all small power tools. Those have made more difference than robotics has, let's say. There's always been talk about robotics, and yes, it may come, but where they innovate is where they can see the direct benefit. And you come up with a new sort of saw that really works well, it'll be all over the building sites within weeks. Yeah, a battery, lithium-ion batteries for power tools everywhere.
But the issue you got, Alan, a lot of the construction companies don't have that DNA to really adopt new things. They're quite, they're like I sell to the industry, and it's jolly hard
You say that, but when somebody comes out with lithium-ion batteries and says we're going to go cordless, they adopt them because they make sense and they work.
Yeah, I think on the
if we
efficiency
as technologists come along with some fancy idea about we're going to use VR headsets for doing something, they'll have a look at it, and they'll say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'd trip over the thing and fall down the manhole. You know, they're very practical people. Anyway,
I think
that's my rant.
No, I think you make a good point as well. I think we have to bear in mind that the construction industry is actually multiple industries. They do have marketing departments. You know, they want to get reach out there. They want to demonstrate that they've got that. So I think, apologies if I'm misquoting you here, Dale. I think Dale was kind of more talking about, if you're talking about digital twin and VR headsets and things along those lines, it's more about selling people of the concept of what needs to be constructed. So not only can you have a very good understanding of what you're building when it comes to digital twins, but you can, to a point you made right at the beginning, Alan, you know, the world is getting smaller. You can send a VR headset over to an investor in another country who can put it on and go, right, I can now walk around this building. I know exactly how it's going to operate. I understand the telemetrics that's going to come out of it. I can see how it's been architected.
I do a lecture on augmented reality sometimes. And one of my best slides is a pavement that I was walking along. And I saw, goodness me, and they got all those spray paint things where they draw on the pavement. And somebody's gone along with a sensor, and they've sensed where the water mains is, where the communications is, where the gas pipes are, and so forth. And they sprayed the lines onto the pavement. So I put that up on the screen. I say to the students, that's augmented reality. It's fantastic. You know, you move your head and it still remains in exactly the right location.
If only they'd all dig them. If they've got to do some maintenance, they'd just dig one hole. And obviously, when they put it all back again, they'd put the lines back. Sorry.
Anyway.
No, thank you for that, guys. Paul, would you like to read out one of Simon's questions in the chat?
Yes, indeed. So Simon's asking, who should have control over a smart city? Is it just the municipality? Should citizens be allowed to control city infrastructure? If so, how? And this is a very significant point. Do we have appropriate security models for distributed control?
He's hit the nail on the head. It's a problem. It's a major problem, and it's one that actually you've got to be really worried about. And not only that, but you need to be worried about where your technologies come from. You know, what security protocols are inside the technology, how robust is it to malicious attack, and all the rest. This is the big headache, if you like, around all the smart cities at the moment.
And to bear in mind,
number one. The question about control, though, is a separate one. And my hunch is that this will work when control is distributed and democratic and so forth. But that's also the point at which the biggest challenge is so far as security and everything else are concerned. As soon as you open it up and distribute it, it becomes bloody difficult to guarantee that it's safe.
But haven't we already? Have we not already lost control? You know, in my previous business, I was building navigation, collecting a lot of city data with local authorities. But when you look at like the likes of navigation across city, most people using some sort of form of Google Maps, right? And in terms of like, you know, they already have quite a lot of data from all the different users and using that for traffic navigation, you know, road speeds, you know, ETAs. You know, that to me is like, you know, nowadays when I sort of I live in London, whenever I go anywhere, I use that to determine really fairly accurate, you know, journey times. And that hasn't come from any local authority. That hasn't come from any central government. That's come from innovators who have sort of just gone and actually scaled the stuff. And that's scary because you're sort of like, you know, we don't pay anything for it. Really, it's free of charge, which is just amazing. You know, which is like scary as well.
Sorry, you say you don't pay for it.
Yeah.
Google's business model is they're using your data and they're selling it on.
You're the product. You're the product.
Indeed, yeah, no, and that's worrying as well, right? But that just shows the local authorities in their cities that no matter how much money you've got, we can grow faster and take control quicker. Yeah. So I think we have lost control.
The other one is traditional security models just don't work in these scenarios. So the threat vectors the threat landscape has become so big, the threat vectors are changing, and the traditional model of I'll build lots and lots of concentric walls of different heights to try and make it really difficult to get in. And the problem we've got now is if anyone, if you don't tackle security in the way, any chink in your armor, the traditional small door in the Great Wall of China, becomes a way that people can exploit that single weakness and get much more dangerous access into your higher value data. So it is more about understanding the behavior of the devices that you've got, what's happening, and again, I think a point somebody else made is how you secure your supply chain. So just if something is really cheap in terms of a sensor, there's possibly a reason why it's really cheap. So not only do you have to start thinking about security, you have to think about management, you have to think about firmware, you have to think about control, you have to think about how all of your devices are operating, how you understand their behavior. So to use a really simple example, is that printer in an office really supposed to be uploading files to Dropbox outside of its normal behavior because it should receive something and print it? So we start having to think about the behavior of the devices that are living inside our networks. It's actually, to give you the official term, it's called user and behavior entity analytics, which is in sort of using AIs to look at the behavior of the explosion of connected devices that you've got in your environment and make sure they're not doing malicious things. Because, by the way, your IoT networks are going to be attacked by AIs. So you need them both, poacher and, well, they're going to be fight fire with fire, poacher term gatekeeper, however you want to view it. We need to bring AIs in a way of as defending our data, as well as, because cyber criminals are definitely using it as a way to attack it.
So this is all very Neil Stephenson, really, isn't it? What we're into here is the world of sci-fi written back in the 70s, all foreseen.
Yes, yeah, oh yes. So manifest, we're seeing it today, because what is traditional cybersecurity? It's implementation of a security pattern. What are AIs fantastic at? Spotting patterns. So yes, we're definitely seeing them being used.
So the answer then is working without a pattern. Yeah?
There are a number of ways that you can tackle it. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Great. So Simon has one more question. Is UK and local authority awareness of the Open and Agile Smart Cities project poor, which defines minimal interoperability models? I'm not sure I said that right. I'll repeat that. Is the UK local authority awareness of the Open and Agile Smart Cities project poor, which defines minimal interoperability models? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Paul.
I think he's asking whether or not the local authorities are aware of.
I think they're saying, is the awareness not very good? Yeah.
I don't know the answer. I'm not a local authority. I must say that we do a lot of work in the department with local authorities to work on increasing their understanding of security and so forth. That is part of what the support of local government does. But local authorities are subject to cybercrime weekly, and it's a running battle to keep pace with this. And most local authorities aren't really into smart very much yet, to be quite honest. They've got legacy systems that aren't patched, that and most attacks are ransomware.
Okay.
I'm not sure the answer to his question, but
yes. Paul, I think I'm not sure whether we should go to our reserved question or whether we should close out here. What do you think?
I think we should probably close out here, because the reserve question basically opens up almost an entirely
it might be another
webinar in and of itself.
Great. Well, in that case, I'd just like to offer the panelists any other, if they'd like to raise anything else, or if there's any closing statements that you'd like to make in the last couple of minutes. The answer can be no, but if anyone does want to share any other opinions they didn't manage to share in the session, now is the time.
No, I think we've covered it. We've covered it. Like, how do you close out on that? It just shows how much there is
Yeah.
We talked about offices in built environments, right? It's just huge, but super exciting. It's just super exciting because there's so much change, and it is human based, right? It's all about people living in urban areas, and I think it's an innovator's dream to be doing this. And I think what's interesting, I think local authorities are starting to realise that innovators are part of the solution, and that's super exciting for all of us.
I'd like to sort of throw one googly in, if you like, which is one of the things we've learned from social media and Facebook. You now have thousands of connections on your Facebook account, your social media account, and what we've found is that partly because of the algorithms, the friending algorithms, or the what you're interested in algorithms, partly just because of the numbers of connections that are in the graph, that you're ending up with polarization. So everybody who talks together are in their own echo chambers of being Republicans or Democrats, or being climate change deniers versus greeny people, or whatever. And that is highly problematic. But some of the science is suggesting that that's a result of connectivity in the network and the nature of the algorithm. Now, what's going to be the unintended consequence? I don't think any of that was intentional, by the way, on the part of Facebook or any of them. What's the unintended consequence of smart city technologies, of sensor networks, of connectivity, of stuff, Internet of Things, of autonomous vehicles, all the different things we've talked about? And is there a way that we could begin to think through in advance what those unintended consequences might be, in such a way that we wouldn't, invent the friending algorithm that ends up creating polarization socially, or whatever the equivalent is in smart cities? It's a challenge, I think. It's a challenge for sort of philosophy and mathematics as much as it is for the technologies themselves.
Just going on from that, I think two of my biggest concerns, I'll be really quick. One is privacy, and the second one is the future of work, which is definitely going to be disrupted with the smart cities. So I'll just leave it at that.
Just a part, this technology is advancing at speed. So I think what we need to do is make sure that all of the ethical concerns that have been raised, we've got separate tracks thinking about that. So the IoT technologies are moving at pace. We need to make sure that regulation, compliance, ethical considerations, security, and connectivity all move at the same pace, so that they all kind of arrive at some of the key milestones that I think are going to evolve in the technology at about the same time.
And governance structures, distributed versus centralized, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Plenty of scope.
Yes, sure.
I mean, we could go on for another hour, I'm sure. But thank you, every one of our panelists, for joining and for getting so involved in the discussion. Honestly, it was so interesting. I know that we could go on. But thank you, everyone, for joining, giving up your time, to all the audience members for listening and asking questions. And yeah, I'm hoping that we'll have another event in the calendar soon that we'll be able to all meet again. But yes, thank you so much for your time from BCS and from Paul and myself. Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Oh, simply, I want to thank you for being so engaged and involved, because it makes a massive difference. And clearly this is an important thing to think about, and hopefully some people will go away and think about it and come up with some of the potential solutions.
Exactly. No, thank you, everyone. I'll let everyone drop off slowly now, but thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.